The clock on the wall read 2 a.m. Mark stood motionless in the center of his office. The only light source was the monitor, casting a harsh blue flicker over stacks of reports that had not changed in weeks. He did not sit. The chair felt like a trap, and the desk was buried under the debris of a career that had stalled years ago. Silence filled the room, thick and absolute. He watched the cursor blink on the screen, a steady rhythmic pulse that matched the ticking of the clock. Every report was a record of work he had completed, yet nothing moved forward. He turned his head to the window. Outside, the city was dark and unresponsive. The air in the room felt heavy, chilled by the ventilation system that had long since stopped cycling warm air. He looked back at the screen. The bank account balance was minimized in the corner, a static reminder of the debt he had been avoiding for months. His pulse slowed. He shifted his weight, his boots clicking against the floorboards, and the sound echoed into the corners of the office. He was trapped in the same space he had occupied every night for 3 years. The reports remained unfinished. The stagnation was not just on the desk, it was the entire room. He reached for the mouse, his movements slow and deliberate. The cursor hovered over a file named Resignation, Final, V3. He clicked. The document opened, revealing the same 3 paragraphs he had written, deleted, and rewritten 3 times over the past month. He read the words again. They were clean, concise, and entirely hollow. He traced the letters on the screen with his index finger, feeling the flat, cold glass. For years, he had told himself the economy was the reason for his lack of progress. He had blamed the quarterly budget cuts, the shifting management, and the lack of project funding. He looked at the date on the header. It was 6 months out of date. He had been drafting this document since the start of the year. He remembered the conversations he had practiced in the shower, the arguments he had prepared for a manager who never listened, and the excuses he had refined until they sounded like facts. He leaned back, his spine popping against the chair. The office lights hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the pens in his cup. He looked at the printer in the corner, its tray empty of paper. He had the power to make this real, yet his hand remained on the mouse, clicking the minimize button instead of the print icon. The document vanished, returning him to the spreadsheets. The minimized window flickered. A system notification pushed the bank dashboard back to the center of the monitor. The numbers were not just digits. They were a physical wall. Red text highlighted the remaining balance against the mounting interest rates. Mark grabbed the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white as he leaned into the blue glare. He did not look away this time. He tracked the column of debt, item by item, matching each figure to a month of missed opportunities and stalled projects. The silence of the office shifted. It was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He reached for his phone to check the balance again, but his hand stopped midair. The truth was right there on the screen, inescapable and precise. He looked at the empty cubicles surrounding him, then back at the red numbers. Every excuse he had relied on the market trends. The bad luck, the lack of support dissolved under the cold, mathematical certainty of the debt. He stood in the center of the room, breathing the stale, recycled air, and for the first time in years, he stopped searching for a scapegoat. The math did not care about his history. It only demanded a solution. The room stayed silent, waiting for him to break. Mark reached out and clicked the close icon on the resignation draft. The file disappeared. He did not hesitate. He opened a blank document, the white screen bright enough to make him squint. His fingers hovered over the keys, then began to move, rhythmic and sharp. He was not typing a list of grievances anymore. He typed the name of a business, the structure of a supply chain, and the math of his own survival. Each word appeared on the screen, solid and undeniable. He did not feel a rush of excitement or a sudden lightness. Instead, he felt a density in his chest, a physical heaviness that demanded his full attention. The weight of his future was no longer an abstract worry. It was a concrete set of tasks sitting right there on his monitor. He adjusted his chair, leaned forward, and typed until his wrists ached. He checked the time. It was past 3 in the morning, but the exhaustion he usually felt had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He saved the file, backed up the data to a drive, and sat back. The silence in the office remained, but it was no longer a cage. It was a space he had finally begun to fill with his own intention. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long, thin bars across his desk. Mark did not wait for the office to fill. He arrived before the cleaners, printed the letter, and placed it on the supervisor's chair. The paper felt heavy in his hand, the ink still fresh. He watched the elevator light blink as it descended. When the doors opened, he stepped inside. The lobby was empty, the marble floor cold under his feet. He walked toward the main entrance, his pace steady, neither fast nor slow. He pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped onto the sidewalk. The city noise hit him immediately, a wall of sirens, engines, and distant shouting. He looked back once. The office building stood rigid and tall, a familiar cage he had finally unlocked. He turned away and started walking. No one called out, no one tried to stop him. The safety of the cubicle was gone, replaced by the chaotic, open air of the street. He reached into his pocket, gripped his keys, and felt the metal bite into his palm. He was outside. The air tasted sharp, cold, and entirely his own. He kept walking, putting distance between his boots and the glass doors, moving toward the library without looking back again. The library basement was quiet, smelling of old adhesive and paper dust. Mark chose a table in the furthest corner, away from the hum of the circulation desk. He dumped his bag, spilling a notebook and a stack of printed articles onto the wood surface. He opened a technical manual on global logistics and began to read. The jargon was dense, a wall of industry-specific terms that forced him to pause every few sentences to look up definitions in a secondary dictionary. He gripped his pen until his knuckles turned white, underlining key metrics and drawing diagrams of flow patterns in the margins. He spent hours tracing the paths of raw materials through international ports, mapping out the inefficiencies he intended to solve. His eyes burned from the glare of the desk lamp, and his back stiffened against the chair, but he did not move. He was no longer waiting for instructions or a manager to approve his workload. Every page he turned was a calculation of his own future. He swapped the manual for a ledger, translating the theory into his own emerging business model. The transition from earning a salary to building a structure from scratch was a slow, grueling process. He did not look up until the lights in the library dimmed for closing, signaling the end of his first day as a student of his own ambition. Mark stood in a windowless boardroom, his hands resting on a stack of printed proposals. The man across the table did not even look at the final page. He pushed the document back, his expression indifferent. This model lacks scalability. Try again. Mark walked out of the building. The rejection felt like a physical weight in his chest, but he did not stop. He went to a nearby coffee shop, opened his laptop, and highlighted the specific clauses the client had criticized. Over the next 6 months, the pattern repeated. He pitched to logistics managers, small business owners, and venture scouts. Some dismissed him within minutes. Others listened, poked holes in his supply chain projections, and sent him away. Each no became a data point. He began to track the objections in a ledger, categorizing them by industry, cost, and risk. He stopped taking the silence after a rejection as a personal failure. Instead, he treated it as a diagnostic tool. He scrutinized his pitch, stripped away the unnecessary filler, and rebuilt his arguments around concrete efficiency metrics. He grew familiar with the sound of a closing door. With every refusal, he refined his focus, turning his initial frustration into a cold, methodical urgency. He was not just looking for a contract anymore. He was looking for the flaw that would eventually make his business impossible to ignore. Mark sat at his desk, the screen light casting a harsh glare over his notes. He was stripping his pitch down to the studs. The previous rejection had highlighted a flaw in his transit cost analysis that he had ignored for weeks. He opened his spreadsheet, deleted the optimistic projections, and replaced them with rigorous, worst-case scenario data. He stopped looking for validation and started hunting for points of failure. He spent hours stress-testing his own model, calculating the impact of port delays and fuel price spikes on his margins. Every time he found a weakness, he adjusted the logic, rewriting the slide deck to address the concern before a client could even raise it. He worked in complete silence, his focus narrowing until the rest of the room blurred out of existence. His hands moved with a practiced rhythm, typing, deleting, recalculating, and refining. He was no longer trying to persuade. He was building a bulletproof argument. By the time he finished, the pitch was half its original length, but twice as dense. He saved the file, leaned back, and rubbed his eyes. The anger that had fueled his early efforts was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical determination to survive. He closed the laptop, knowing the next encounter would be different. He was finally ready to test the machine he had built. The bank notification arrived at dawn, a stark red line indicating his balance had dipped below survival levels. Mark stared at the screen, then at his pantry, which held little more than coffee and dry staples. He canceled his internet subscription, opting to use public library access and stop buying anything that was not strictly essential to his business. The transition from a steady salary to absolute scarcity was not a singular shock, but a slow, grinding attrition. He sold his small television, then his extra desk chair, watching his living space grow increasingly hollow. The silence in his apartment became a constant companion. Friends stopped calling when he declined every invitation to go out, citing his lack of funds. He grew accustomed to the quiet. He spent his evenings calculating the cost of every meal, every commute, and every minute. The isolation began to seep into his thoughts, making the outside world feel like a distant, irrelevant hum. He sat in his chair, the room dimly lit, and opened his ledger again. The numbers were shrinking, but his focus remained fixed on the next potential contract. He did not look for comfort. He simply turned the page, adjusted his budget for the coming week, and forced himself to ignore the encroaching cold of an empty room. 5 in the morning arrived with the same gray light every day. Mark stood at his kitchen counter, the coffee maker clicking, and his mind immediately began the familiar corrosive count of days without a win. The doubt was a persistent hum, a voice suggesting that he was simply running in place while his life eroded. He looked at his calendar, marked with the same tasks he had completed for weeks with no tangible result. He felt the urge to put his head down and sleep, to escape the crushing weight of the unknown. He fought the impulse by physically forcing his hands to open the ledger. He stared at the empty space where a new contract should have been. He picked up his pen and recorded his planned activity for the morning, breaking the business plan into granular, hourly blocks. He did not look for motivation. He looked for the next task. He moved his chair, sat at the desk, and opened his market analysis files. He read the first line, then the second. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, the doubt had been pushed into the background, buried under the sheer momentum of his schedule. He was not winning yet, but he refused to lose to his own mind. He kept typing. The morning of the meeting, Mark turned the ignition key. The engine shuddered, emitted a sharp metallic grind, and died. He turned it again, nothing but a hollow click. He tried a third time, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white, but the car remained cold and silent. He checked his watch. The client was expecting him in 40 minutes, and the office was 2 miles away across the city. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel, the sound echoing in the small cabin. He stepped out, locked the door, and looked down the road. The heat began to rise from the asphalt, shimmering in the distance. He had no funds for a taxi, and no time for public transit. He shifted his bag to his shoulder, adjusted the strap, and stepped onto the sidewalk. He did not look back at the broken car. He focused on the path ahead, calculating his pace to arrive on time. The distance was daunting, but he had already committed to the goal. He broke into a steady, rhythmic stride. He ignored the initial sting of the rising temperature. He kept his eyes forward, his breathing measured, and his mind locked on the contract waiting for his signature. The meeting was the only thing that mattered now. The sun climbed higher, turning the concrete into a baking plate. Mark felt the heat soak into his skin, a steady, oppressive weight that demanded he slow down. Every mile was a battle against his own biology. His legs burned, and a thin film of salt stung his eyes. But he did not deviate from his pace. He passed a shaded storefront and felt the pull of the cool air, the temptation to stop and rest, but he forced his eyes back to the road. He was not just walking to a meeting. He was walking away from the stagnation that had defined his life for years. He counted his steps to keep his rhythm, syncing his breathing to the cadence of his boots, striking the pavement. The fatigue was a constant, dull throb in his calves, yet he felt a strange, cold clarity. He was choosing this path. He was choosing the effort. Every drop of sweat was a reminder that he was no longer waiting for permission to succeed. He rounded a corner, the destination finally coming into view. He did not break his stride. He wiped his forehead, tightened his grip on his bag, and accelerated his pace, turning the physical agony into the fuel that would carry him through the door. Mark stopped outside the heavy glass doors of the office building. He pulled his shoulders back, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. He looked at his own reflection in the glass and saw a man covered in dust, his face slick with sweat, his hair matted against his forehead. He did not try to brush the grime away. He knew it was too late for appearances. He pushed the door open and walked into the climate-controlled lobby. The temperature drop was instantaneous, making his damp skin shiver. He crossed the polished floor, his boots leaving faint, dark marks on the marble. He reached the reception desk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The receptionist looked up, her expression shifting from polite interest to visible surprise. He ignored her stare and nodded toward the inner office. He walked past the rows of desks, the quiet hum of the office dying away as people turned to watch him pass. He reached the client's door and pushed it open. The client sat behind a mahogany desk, looking up as Mark entered. The air in the room felt thin. Mark stood there, breathless and unkempt, the silence stretching between them until it was almost loud. He did not apologize for his state. He simply set his bag on the floor and locked eyes with the man across from him. Mark cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet office. He opened his bag and laid the documents out on the mahogany surface, ignoring the way his hands shook from lingering fatigue. He started with the numbers. He spoke of the supply chain inefficiencies he had studied for months, mapping out a path for cost reduction that was both aggressive and logical. He did not stutter. He did not offer excuses for his arrival. He directed every word at the client, his gaze locked and unwavering. The client leaned forward, his initial look of judgment replaced by a hard, analytical stare. Mark pointed to the graphs, tracing the lines of potential growth with a steady finger. He explained the logistics of the transition, the risks he had identified, and the precise steps to mitigate them. Every sentence was a brick in a wall of sound evidence. The client flipped through the pages, his pen hovering, then tapping against the desk. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer heavy with tension, but thick with deliberation. Mark finished his final point and waited. He stood perfectly still, his breathing slowing, watching as the client looked up. The man's eyes were sharp, searching Mark's face for a weakness, but finding only the resolve of a man who had already walked through fire to be there. The client tapped the edge of the contract against the mahogany. He did not look up. He read the final page again, his eyes moving slowly across the terms Mark had spent months refining. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Mark stood motionless, his muscles locked, his gaze fixed on the ink-stained nib of the fountain pen. The client set the paper flat. He reached out, the pen scratching against the heavy fiber of the document. Each stroke was deliberate. The signature appeared, black and permanent. He set the pen down with a soft click and pushed the folder across the desk. Mark reached out and took it. The weight of the folder in his hand felt like a physical anchor. It was not a grand explosion of sound or light, but the quiet, heavy reality of a threshold crossed. 6 months of rejection, the miles walked in the heat, the hours spent in library aisles, they had all converged into this single, tangible object. Mark felt the tension leave his neck, replaced by a steady, cold clarity. He did not smile. He simply tucked the folder under his arm, nodded once, and turned toward the door. The path ahead was no longer a theory. It was a map he had just earned the right to follow. Mark stepped into his apartment and locked the door behind him. The space remained exactly as he had left it that morning. He did not pour a drink or call anyone to share the news. He walked straight to his kitchen table, cleared away a stack of dry mail and a cold coffee mug, and laid the contract flat under the harsh glare of the overhead light. He reached for his ledger, a worn book with a spine reinforced by tape. He opened it to the page he had kept blank for months. With a steady hand, he wrote the date, the name of the client, and the exact figure of the initial deposit. The ink flowed dark and clean. He watched it dry for a moment, the numbers standing as a stark, objective truth against the paper. This was not a windfall or a lucky break. It was the result of a calculation he had made 6 months prior. He closed the ledger, aligned the edges of the book with the edge of the table, and set his pen down parallel to the spine. He was already thinking about the next entry, the next client, and the next sequence of tasks. The room was quiet, but the air felt different. It was no longer the silence of stagnation, but the calm of an engine that had finally caught, idling with a low, consistent hum. The next morning, the alarm triggered at 5 a.m. Outside, the world was still locked in pre-dawn shadow. Mark sat up, his body heavy with the remnants of sleep, and his muscles stiff from the previous day. He did not hit snooze. He did not hesitate. He swung his feet onto the floor, the cold wood biting into his soles, and moved directly to his desk. He opened his laptop, the screen light casting a harsh, artificial glow against the dark walls. He began to parse market trends, line by line, graph by graph. His eyes burned and his head throbbed, but he did not stop to rest. He treated his energy levels as irrelevant data points, secondary to the objective requirement of his work. Every morning became a repetition of this process. Whether he was energized or depleted, whether the night before had been productive or stagnant, the routine remained absolute. He built his business not on bursts of inspiration, but on the relentless, predictable accumulation of hours. By the time the sun climbed over the horizon, he had already analyzed 3 sectors and updated his strategy. He was no longer waiting for opportunities to find him. He was building a foundation that compelled them to appear. The habit was no longer a choice. It was the new architecture of his day, a rigid, disciplined frame that held everything else in place. The cycles of 5 a.m. analysis continued until they became the rhythm of his life. 1 month bled into the next, and the initial painful friction of his work smoothed into a predictable, high-output machine. He stopped counting the hours and started measuring the compounding results. At the end of the 2nd year, he sat in his office and pulled the final report for the quarter. He compared the figures to the records he had kept since his first contract. The revenue had doubled. It was not a sudden explosion of profit, but the inevitable consequence of 700 days of steady, focused labor. His enterprise had transitioned from a fragile, one-man operation into a stable, thriving entity that functioned without his constant, frantic intervention. Clients arrived through referrals instead of cold calls. Systems he had designed in the quiet of early mornings now ran with minimal oversight. He looked at the balance on his screen, no longer a blinking source of anxiety, but a testament to the long-term strategy he had refused to abandon. The business was no longer a hope, it was a structure built of stone. He had moved past the point of mere survival. Every decision he had forced himself to make in the cold, early light had finally paid its dividend, compounding into a reality that was entirely of his own making. Mark leaned back in his chair, the silence of the office now a comfortable companion rather than a heavy weight. His gaze drifted to the corner of the desk where, 2 years prior, the screen had blinked with the threat of debt. He traced the timeline in his mind, stripping away the illusion that success was a singular spark or a sudden stroke of fortune. There was no grand moment of triumph to point to, no climactic flash that had changed everything. The change had been incremental. It lived in the thousands of small, uncelebrated choices he had made when he was tired, frustrated, or uncertain. He realized then that the turning point was not the day the contract was signed, but that night at 2 a.m. when he finally stopped waiting for permission to exist. The act of deleting that resignation draft had been a quiet declaration of ownership. He had spent years blaming the world for his stagnation, but the reality was simpler. He had been waiting for someone else to move the needle. By deciding to write his own plan, he had accepted the weight of his own future. The success he saw now was merely the physical manifestation of that original, silent commitment to stop waiting and start doing. It was a process of slow, deliberate construction, built brick by brick in the dark. Mark pulled a fresh, unused notebook from his drawer, the paper crisp and blank against the wood. He set it down, the sound echoing softly in the quiet office. He took a pen, tested the ink against the margin, and began to write. These were not the frantic notes of a man desperate for survival, but the measured objectives of a man building a long-term legacy. He mapped out the next 5 years, breaking down milestones into actionable daily tasks. He knew the path ahead remained long and demanding, but the uncertainty that once paralyzed him had vanished. There was no longer a need to wait for external validation or a perfect set of circumstances. He finished the final entry, closed the cover, and stood up from the desk. He walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He did not look for an exit or a reprieve. He looked at the horizon, identifying the next peak he intended to reach. He stepped away from the desk, moved toward the door, and walked out into the hallway. He took the first step, then the next, and continued forward, his pace steady, his direction clear, and his resolve entirely his own.